Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line. I know that one place parents want us to draw the line is with violence in video games. The fact is that a new generation of video games crosses that line, containing the most horrible depictions of graphic violence and sex, including particularly violence against women. Like the Grinch who stole Christmas, these violent video games threaten to rob this particular holiday season of a spirit of goodwill. Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture.
That was Senator Joe Lieberman in December of 1993, opening the hearings on violent video games. For parents, this was a moral crisis. For politicians, it was an easy way to score points. But for the gaming industry, it was an existential threat. At the time, the industry had no unified rating system. If Congress didn't like what they saw, regulation was on the table. And at the center of the storm were two games, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. In arcades, Mortal Kombat was making headlines for its graphic violence and blood-soaked fatalities. On the Sega CD, Night Trap, a full-motion video experiment, was accused of promoting lurid, sexualized violence against women. To gamers, they were just two of the hottest new releases. But to the companies being hauled before Congress, they were a problem that demanded a response. And instead of standing with game developers to defend creative freedom, Nintendo saw an opportunity. They didn't just distance themselves from the controversy. They used the hearings as a platform to paint themselves as guardians of family values, even if it meant throwing Sega and the rest of the industry under the bus.
In the mid-1980s, when Nintendo entered the video game business in this country, the issue of violence in video games was not in the public's eye. But just like today, there was a computer software industry selling video games, and some of these games contained excessive violence and pornographic material. We didn't want Nintendo's name associated with this kind of product. Even then, we were concerned about game content. Furthermore, I can't let you sit here and buy this nonsense that this Sega Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults. The fact of the matter is, this is a copy of the packaging. There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do. When they started getting heat about this game, then they adopted the rating system and put ratings on it. Nintendo has video game guidelines which control game content, and we've applied these to every one of the more than 1,200 games released into the marketplace by Nintendo and its licensees. And over the last 8 years, these guidelines have kept an enormous amount of offensive material, including excessive violence, out of American homes.
When Howard Lincoln took the microphone for Nintendo, he wasn't there to defend the medium. He was there to defend Nintendo. He bragged that the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat had been stripped of blood and toned down fatalities. Proof, he said, that Nintendo took the issue of violence seriously. And he didn't stop there. Lincoln singled out Sega's Night Trap as evidence of the competitor's irresponsibility, promising that it would never appear on a Nintendo system.
In the past year, some very violent and offensive games have reached the market. And of course, I'm speaking about Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. And let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system. Obviously, it would not pass our guidelines. This game, which as you've indicated, promotes violence against women, simply has no place in our society.
The message was clear. Sega was corrupting children, and Nintendo was the responsible parent in the room. But this framing ignored one crucial fact. Sega wasn't turning a blind eye. In 1993, Sega had already launched their own rating system, the Video Game Rating Council, with categories for general audiences, MA13, and MA17. They argued that gamers weren't just kids anymore. The audience was getting older, and the industry needed to acknowledge it. Sega wanted a system that reflected that change, one that gave parents the tools to make informed choices without censoring games meant for older players.
In recent days, the glare of the media spotlight on this issue has resulted in the circulation of a number of distorted and inaccurate claims. The most damaging of these distortions, in my view, is the notion that Sega and the rest of the digital interactive industry are only in the business of selling games to children. This is not the case. Yes, many of Sega's interactive video titles are intended and purchased for young children. Many other Sega titles, however, are intended for and purchased by adults for their personal entertainment and education. Evolving interactive technology has spawned a huge market that goes well beyond the child-oriented directed titles that gave the industry its start. The intent with the Sega video game rating system and the independent council and the packaging guidelines that we've established, Senator, is to take a first step. And we're proud of that step we've taken. We don't believe it's perfect, but we do believe that more information and a better rating system is the answer, not regulation and certainly not censorship.
Bill White drove the point home with numbers, noting that the average Sega CD owner was already 22 years old. This wasn't speculation about the future, it was the reality of who was playing games even then. Nintendo's response was to dismiss it entirely. Lincoln accused White of misleading Congress, pointing to current sales data as proof that games were still for children.
I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been, and Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do.
But this blurred an obvious distinction. Sega was talking about the trend, the direction the industry was moving. Nintendo clung to the present to deny the future they knew was coming, because admitting it was inconvenient for their carefully crafted, family-friendly image. And Lincoln didn't stop there. He went on to reframe Nintendo's iron-fisted control of the NES as yet another moral safeguard. According to Lincoln, their licensing system, the same system that forced third-party publishers into exclusivity deals and sparked repeated lawsuits, was really about protecting kids. By keeping a tight grip on what games appeared on the NES, Nintendo claimed they were ensuring violent and sexually suggestive content never reached children.
So in 1985, when we launched our first Nintendo home video game system, we made a conscious business decision not to allow excessively violent, sexually explicit, or other offensive games in our system. We incorporated a patented security chip in all Nintendo hardware and software, and this enabled us to review and approve the content of all video games played on Nintendo's hardware, either video games sold directly by Nintendo or games marketed by our approximately 70 independent third-party licensee companies.
But in reality, this was never about morality. It was about money and control. Nintendo didn't threaten retailers who sold unlicensed games to protect children. They did so to protect their bottom line. Yet in front of Congress, they spun it as a story about values. When you put all this together, the picture is clear. Sega argued for informed parents and creative freedom, pointing to an audience that was already growing older. Nintendo denied it, clung to the present, and dressed up their business practices as moral responsibility. Looking back, there's really no honest way to interpret this moment except to admit that Sega was right. And history backed them up. Just a couple years later, the PlayStation would explode onto the market and redefine gaming as something for teenagers and adults. Sega saw that shift coming. Nintendo knew it too, But instead of standing with their competitors to defend free expression, they used the hearings as a stage to advertise their family-friendly image and cast themselves as the protector of children. But Nintendo didn't just use the hearings to promote themselves. They used them to attack Sega, their only real competitor at the time. By 1993, Sega had outflanked Nintendo in the marketing war. The Genesis wasn't just another console, it was the cool console. Everyone remembers Sega does what Nintendon't. They leaned hard into an older, edgier audience, and they mocked Nintendo as the boring system for kids. The campaign worked. Sega captured the majority of the American market, and Nintendo hated it. So when Howard Lincoln told Congress that Nintendo had sacrificed profits by censoring Mortal Kombat, it wasn't just about appearing virtuous. It was about flipping that cultural script. He admitted players accused them of censorship, but claimed that was proof of Nintendo's integrity. And he drove the point home by saying that Nintendo knew when they chose to censor the blood that Sega would include it. In other words, Sega was out for profit, while Nintendo was standing on principle.
Let me turn to Mortal Kombat. To meet our game guidelines, we insisted that one of our largest licensees, Acclaim Entertainment, remove the blood and death sequences present in the arcade version of Mortal Kombat before we would approve this game. We did this knowing that our competitor would leave these scenes in, and with full knowledge that we would make more money if we included the offensive material. We knew that we would lose money by sanitizing Mortal Kombat, but sanitize it we did. And unfortunately, I must say that we have been criticized by literally thousands of young game players for insisting that the death sequences be removed from this game.
What's been the form of that criticism?
We've received letters. We've received literally thousands of phone calls.
Those people actually call and write to complain that they can't have the more violent game on the Nintendo system.
That's correct. The letters and the phone calls essentially say, leave in the violence. You're censoring.
But again, this was less about morality and more about marketing. Nintendo understood that in the long term, their family-friendly image was far more valuable than the proceeds from a single title. And they took advantage of the situation to use a moral panic to attack the very strategy that had given Sega the edge, appealing to older gamers with edgier content. If Congress cracked down, Sega had much more to lose than Nintendo. But Congress didn't crack down. Lawmakers made noise, but they stopped short of imposing strict regulation. And when Nintendo's plan failed, their principles went with it. Less than a year later, Mortal Kombat 2 landed on the Super Nintendo with every fatality and every drop of blood intact. The very features Nintendo condemned in Congress had suddenly become their selling point. And to be clear, this wasn't Nintendo changing its values. It was proof that they never believed their own testimony. In Washington, they talked about principles. In the marketplace, they followed the money. And they tried and failed to kneecap Sega in the process. Despite Nintendo's assurances before Congress, what won out at the end of the day was good old-fashioned opportunism with a big dose of hypocrisy. They were willing to censor when it protected their image, and uncensor when it protected their bottom line. In the end, Congress didn't regulate games. But the pressure worked. The industry responded by creating the ESRB in 1994, a unified ratings board that gave parents the information they needed while leaving room for mature titles. And that's the irony. Despite the cultural memory of Sega being hammered in these hearings, they got exactly what they had been arguing for all along. They wanted parents to be informed, not games to be censored. Nintendo, on the other hand, wanted decisive government action. They wanted to posture as moral guardians, stunt Sega's edge in the marketplace, and protect their image at any cost.
The point that I'm making, Senator, is that the game ratings, it just doesn't go far enough. We have to get our hands on the game content. So the point I'm getting at is putting these ratings on, if that's as far as we're going to go, isn't going to get us anywhere. We've got to get further into this.
History sided with Sega, but the hearings left scars. They cemented video games in the public imagination as a cultural menace, a stigma that politicians still return to decades later. Rather than fight that narrative, Nintendo helped write it. Instead of standing up for the industry, they sold it out. Sega was right. The rating system worked, and gaming grew up. But Nintendo's testimony ensured that when people think of video games and violence, the first thing they remember is the moral panic, not the truth. And if you need one last reminder of how empty their performance really was,
and let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system.